Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. If you are here for the New York Media Meetup, you are in the right place. Really excited for this discussion. So I'm going to go through just a brief introduction while folks trickle in, and then we'll get right into it. We have our fantastic panelists right here with us. So that's Scott, Mark, and Jay. But first, want to mention that there will be a question and answer portion at the end of the panel. So if you are curious about anything that we did not touch on during the meat of the discussion, just use the feature, the Q&A feature that's embedded in the Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it. We usually do a pretty good job of getting to most of the questions that folks submit, and definitely appreciate those as well. I'm also going to briefly introduce myself and the meetup, because I know there are a lot of folks who are joining us for the first time. So my name is JJ Colao. I run a PR firm called Haymaker Group. We are based out of New York, work with tech companies, some of which you may have heard of, like HubSpot or Gympass or G2 or SoftBank Robotics. Others that you probably haven't because they're young and maybe even haven't launched yet, but hopefully you will soon. So only plug I'll make is we are always looking for great PR folks to hire. So if you are interested in joining a firm that does really good work, you should just shoot me an email and we'd love to speak. And then by way of background, I actually began my career in the media as a reporter at Forbes, where I covered venture capital and startups and technology. And we started this group all the way back in 2014, around the same time that I started Haymaker, the firm. And basically, we organize panels every quarter related to the craft or the business of journalism. So that includes, obviously, today, virtual reality reporting and coverage, and all kinds of other topics that you may be interested in, including workplace reporting, newsletters, sustainability, you name it. So if you like what you hear and see, definitely make sure to join us for the next one. All right, so with that, we will get right into it. And I will begin with just some brief introductions. First, we have Scott Stein, who is the editor-at-large or an editor-at-large at CNET, where he writes about wearable tech, VR, AR, tablets, gaming, and also emerging trends. Scott has been with CNET for 13 years. He's based in New York, and a couple of recent articles that I enjoyed included reviews of the PS VR2, coverage of a virtual Burning Man experience, and also a review of some really cool kind of futuristic haptic gloves, sort of Ready Player One style gloves. And then we also have Mark Sullivan, who is a senior writer at Fast Company, where he writes about major tech platforms like Google and Facebook, Samsung and Apple. Previously spent some time at PC World and at VentureBeat, and some recent VR-focused articles include an exploration of how the Veteran Affairs Agency is using VR as a potential therapy for pain, chronic pain, a review of VR's year in 2022, and also an interview with the Unity CEO, John Riccitiello, which I really enjoyed, which touched on the future of the metaverse. And, you know, that word is kind of a touchy phrase these days. And then also have Jay Peters, who's a news writer at The Verge, where he covers breaking news and consumer technology, also writes about virtual worlds and the technologies that power those virtual worlds. And of course, the companies that are trying to make the quote unquote metaverse happen. Jay previously worked as an editor at TechMeme and also spent some time in PR at WE Communications. And some recent articles on VR include some reviews of PSVR 2 games, and also a look at Manchester City's work with Sony in the metaverse, which as a Premier League fan I enjoyed, and also a look at some of the MetaQuest hand tracking improvements. So with that, we can get right into it. I'm going to start very broad. And Scott, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. And would love to get a sense of how virtual reality fits into your beat. You know, so I think all of you do work that is not solely focused on virtual reality or VR and that technology, but it touches on your work in a number of different ways. So I'd love to just understand how that looks in terms of your day-to-day coverage and how you think about it in relation to all of the work that you do, Scott.
Yeah, I'd say like for me, VR started, when I was interested in the idea in high school, then like, but in tech coverage, 2013, a lot of people getting to see Oculus for the first time, to CS demo kind of kick things off. For me at CNET, I've covered a lot of different beats moving through. I started at doing laptops, then I was doing wearable tech, mobile phones. I'm doing gaming a lot, and VR has been a thread through that. And in a sense, I kind of think of it as a touch point to a lot of those different things. I mean, I think that's what the interesting thing about it is. It's a little amorphous. It gets more amorphous with the metaverse, and I think about the ideas of like what computing or gaming or what it is to have things on you, and what gets annoying and what isn't, what seems to be sticky. Um, that's where it dovetails for me. And I think of it as, it is a continually moving target. So as much as there are reviews of products, until it reaches an everyday use, it's still like checking in on an experimental kind of a landscape. And it's part product, it's part cultural, um, and then it's also part under the technology.
That's very helpful. And Scott, just to even take a step back, or I'm sorry, maybe give folks a sense in a more sort of practical sense. Like you're primarily looking at both hardware and kind of software and gaming experiences, and basically evaluating them for potential buyers of those products or experiences, and also trying to fit those into future technological trends and that sort of thing. So I'd be curious to hear about the audience that you write for as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely a mainstream audience, and I think about that a lot. But I also think about it's funny, like what it is to write about VR makes me think of like, more of like some cultural beats. My background way before this was theater, playwriting, and like, I think that to me, these are all experiences that you kind of digest. They're very experiential types of things, and you kind of have to digest that. They become subjective. They become something that's, about your perceptual system with this. So they're different for each person to some degree. And I think a lot of what I write is kind of translating that. And so there is sort of like a product. I feel like we'll get to the point where there's like what best VR headset there is, in the sense of like best phone or best watch. And that'll be interesting, because it's like I saw that with wearables, where it became a lot more like just people knew all the rules, and there was, you don't need to explain that to me. And we still quite aren't there with VR. So I think that a lot of times I'm translating partly the product experience, partly the app or the the individual experiences, and getting a sense of like, and even things that aren't VR, that they could be immersive theater, or other things that are semi-immersive that can kind of inform what the other is trying to do. Because I think VR and AR are very aspirational right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's so nascent that we're not quite there in terms of just the wire cutter version of buy this headset, that sort of thing. Mark, would love to get a similar sense from you. I mean, my view in sort of looking at your coverage is this is maybe more through the lens of how are these big tech companies, these dominant tech companies, thinking about this as the next emerging technology that they need to get ahead of in order to, win at the game of business. But I'd be curious to hear it, sort of in your words.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. I don't think most people are going to come to me for sort of like a feature by feature review of a new VR headset. I kind of do some of that just because, it kind of fits into what I write. But I think it is, I mean, it's a nice thing for me to be able to kind of write from a little bit of a 30,000-foot view kind of thing. And I do think there's a point that Scott just mentioned about, trying to, in a young technology like this, trying to explain to people, what this company is trying to do, what this tech company is trying to put in front of you, and what it does, and of course, try to understand where it's going to lead to and what the aspiration actually is and what it might deliver 5 years down the road, which is, that's to me, in this area, that's kind of where the fun starts. I think in many ways, there's definitely interesting things to write about, but it's like, it really is kind of directional, I wrote about the Quest Pro, and I found that, what they did in that product was interesting and logical. But, I found my mind kind of wandering toward what future versions of that product might be like, and, where these specific, where the eye tracking might go, what that might be used for 3 or 4 years from now. The pass-through technology where you can see outside at the, is that a thing that's going to blur the line between VR and mixed reality? So I just really relate with that. And I do think that's kind of like what I try to do in some of my writing about VR, is trying to explain to people what I think the thinking is and where it might be going.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think we'll get into some of this later in the conversation, but it's also interesting to me that it's felt like that has been the tenor of the VR conversation for so long. Like, this is indicative of where it's going to go, and we've never quite arrived, but it always feels so close, which is a funny thing to experience for, I don't know, almost 15 years, or however you want to measure it at this point.
I think what I just said probably does apply more to sort of the AR side of this, maybe a little bit less so to VR, which seems maybe a little bit more defined.
Yeah, that's fair in terms of the Quest and the ecosystem that's developing there. Again, want to make sure we get into some of that in just a little bit, but Jay, would love to hear about how you view VR, as a topic kind of within your coverage realm as well.
I think about it. I think I got really interested in it when Meta shifted its whole focus to really try and, it changed its name to Meta to really find a way to make this metaverse idea work. And I think exploring what the metaverse means, whether it's a real concept, whether it's something people want to actually participate in, is there a future for it? I think those sorts of questions are really interesting. I come to that as I'm someone who's played video games for my whole life. I've been playing Fortnite in particular, which is quote unquote one of the better metaverse experiences for 3 or 4 years now. And so, like, I know there are examples of these functional communities of people who exist entirely in graphical environments. And now that these big companies like Meta and rumored to be Apple are making hardware that can create these spaces, I think it's really interesting to explore what they may or may not mean for how we exist online and do things on the internet. And so those are the things that I'm really interested in covering. And of course, VR is just one medium to experience these kinds of worlds.
Do you primarily look at it through a gaming lens? Yeah, either, as a result of kind of your personal experience, or just, I don't know, your mandate at the Verge or that sort of thing?
I wouldn't say I look at it through any one particular lens. It's to me, I'm just trying to figure out, are these things that places that people want to be? And that applies to both the hardware, like is this a headset you want to wear for a long period of time? Is it comfortable? Will it match everybody's faces and individual needs for vision? Like, that's a key part of participating in the metaverse. If you can't wear the hardware that's being asked of you, you can't participate. But then there's also just like the what sort of communities are appearing in these spaces? Why would I want to hang out in any of these spaces when I can just go play Fortnite, when I can play a game on my Nintendo Switch? Like, these virtual spaces are competing for our time just as much as anything else is. And I think it's interesting to think about what is the compelling reason to be there and participate in them.
Yeah, it seems to be something that, billions, maybe trillions of dollars are very interested in figuring out, and maybe have not quite landed on it yet. But you mentioned the metaverse as a term, which I maybe plan to get into later in the conversation, but I think it's worth just digging into it now. And it seems to be a term, I think understandably, that has been misused quite a bit, that induces a little bit of eye rolling, but also means something that is fairly important and also probably has a little bit of substance to it. So I would love to hear your views on that term and where it is and isn't useful. And then maybe we can kind of, back into the plausibility of its existence in any, relevant time period. But I don't want to spend too much time theorizing. I'm more just interested in your take on, is it useful? When? If not, why not? And maybe Scott, we can go back to you.
Yeah.
Jay, why don't we start with you if that works?
Sure. I think metaverse as a term it's mostly marketing. I think it only recently really kind of started to take hold because of Meta's use of it. But like, the concept of the metaverse has existed since, I believe it's Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash is the word that invented it from that book. And Second Life is arguably the expression of the metaverse that launched in 2003. So like, the idea of the metaverse is perhaps not as new as it is being presented right now, but it's also turning into a useful word to describe these not specifically like game or MMO spaces, but like entirely virtual places where people hang out, create content, create worlds. I'm finding it to be the most useful word to describe that, even if not everybody knows what it means, or even if it does not have a set definition. So I have conflicting feelings about the word metaverse, is how I think I would answer that question.
Definitely makes sense. Scott, what's your take?
My happiest times covering this beat are when it's quieter. I think like when Meta went metaverse, it reflooded the zone, which made sense, and it became intolerable. And it's interesting because the way I thought about it, because like I gotten a chance to talk to Mark Zuckerberg like earlier that year, where he was mentioning the metaverse in like March, and like Jay was saying, people have been mentioning metaverse for a long time. And then it seemed to be recoined again. It felt to me like code. It feels like code for the time when people realized that like not everyone's going to be in a VR AR headset, and they need to also acknowledge everyone who's not going to be. And it coincided too, to me, with the pandemic, where virtual became a state of mind or a state of need for people, where they just coined it for their own uses. And so all these people doing all this stuff, whether it's gaming or Zoom, and you got to sort of acknowledge that space and work with it and make things cross-compatible. So to me, that's sort of the most metaversey and massively social, which gets into the part about that, whether it's gaming or social spaces, which VR has had a hard time with. And so I think all those things make sense as to what the metaverse is, or what that space needs to be. But then when it gets so flooded, especially to me in the Web3 and the crypto and all the other things, and a lot of people with businesses and a lot of marketing, it does get way overused. And so I feel like the logic makes sense in a lot of these things for what the concept is, but then the execution, it's like everyone's trying to race to that thing with a billion different tools and solutions that they think are the thing. But that to me is what, like, I'm tired of it, but I also think it makes sense because you can't expect everyone to just be wearing these things. And I think that's what companies are, and that's definitely what Meta seems to be coming to the acknowledgement of. And I just think it's like makes sense with all devices that people use. It's like a supplemental technology.
So again, mixed feelings, which I definitely understand and probably, hold myself. Mark, how about you?
I think the pandemic had a lot to do with it. I think Facebook's actions, changing their name, had something to do with it. I mean, why do we get excited about technology? Why are we excited about ChatGPT? Because it captures our imagination. It becomes cultural. It becomes something more than bits and bytes and pieces of plastic. And I think that happened with the metaverse. Where we are in terms of execution and actually creating these spaces where people want to be, or creating the hardware or whatever it is that makes the on-ramp to these worlds. That's kind of a different story. It's going to probably take a while. It's not something I want to spend my time doing. I mean, Horizon World is like my version of hell right now. So, so again, it's aspirational, and I can, I've, written a few pieces and that have been negative on it, and talked about how overhyped it is, but I can tell you that big brands are very excited about this, and it's real for them. I think the other part of it that I would add is like, really, what is it? I mean, how does it relate to the internet? I mean, it's this idea of having it be like a next version of the internet that you experience in this really immersive way. And, somehow it's protocol based. So, in the same way I can use whatever email client I want on today's internet, I can use whatever piece of hardware or glasses or headset to approach the metaverse at some point in the future. I mean, that's kind of a beautiful idea in a way, where I guess the counterpoint to that is, if it's just Facebook's metaverse, is that still, or excuse me, Meta's metaverse, is that still a metaverse? That's far less exciting. But I don't know. I kind of have faith that I think I don't know the pace, but I think we're going to keep drifting toward this concept in one way or another. I have no idea how long it's going to take to get there.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I also think, at least in my experience, I found Matthew Ball's book very helpful in terms of at least putting some flesh on this and applying some rigor in terms of the technological backbone that needs to happen, and all of the trends that will likely come together to produce something like this, sort of based on previous, technological leaps. And that, in many ways, probably turned me from being, a skeptic to a cautious optimist in terms of this being something that will actually come to pass, within a reasonable time frame. But to all of your points, it is so complicated. And even his definition was like, 4 sentences long. It's hard to have one, binary point of view on all of this. But that is all very helpful to get back into sort of your coverage and your approach to these sorts of stories. I'd be interested in hearing, if you're looking through your inbox, or if you're seeing something online, whatever it is, it comes in, onto your radar. What makes an interesting story for you? What is something that you automatically kind of want to explore, pursue, dig into more deeply as it relates to this topic? And what is maybe something that you're going to let, pass by? And Jay, we're going to go back to you if that works.
Something I've been trying to do is cover particularly Meta's just kind of product and software updates that they've been doing for the Quest, for Horizon Worlds. I mean, the Verge's bread and butter is covering fairly granular feature updates and talking about what they might mean for your day-to-day experience. And I just kind of felt like we weren't doing that for some of this Meta stuff. We'd be talking about the headsets, of course, but I saw an opportunity to really cover those things step by step, brick by brick, because I think to Mark's point, like, this is going to be a slow drift into more of this VR. Like, it's not going to be as immediately obvious as the smartphone was, I feel like. And so covering these moment by moment changes and updates, I think that's important to understand how Meta and how these companies are reacting to the changes that need to be made to make these safe environments, to make them interesting environments, to make the hardware novel to use. Like, I think it's all the small stuff really adds up over time. And I really like covering that stuff. I think that's really fascinating for me personally. And then it's looking for where are the interesting communities or builders or creators within virtual reality, within metaverse spaces, and what are they doing? Because the companies may all have one idea of how all of their products are supposed to be used, but what are people actually doing? I think there's often an interesting delta between those two places.
That's interesting. So it's taking a look at the creative energy and where those folks are focused and what's exciting in terms of that realm, and also looking at the technological kind of incremental progress that's happening via some of these bigger players. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, because I think those could kind of feed into itself. Like, where if Meta makes a small update to how building works in Horizon Worlds, that might be the one key thing that a creator has been waiting for to make their grand vision of a world they've been trying to build. And then Meta sees how those people use those tools and adjusts and tweaks them, not only from a software level, but maybe makes changes to hardware plans down the line. And so just seeing how those things play off each other, I think that's really interesting.
Right. So it's that feedback loop, of development and creative energy and the structure, the frameworks that are in place to allow for all of that and encourage that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Scott, how about you?
Sorry about that. I'm kind of an experience collector a lot of the time. I think that, like, being able to try something, being able to see it informs all the other experiences, and then you sort of build up a repertoire. I guess, like anything, you compare against these things. It reminds me of, like, I keep thinking about the early wearable tech landscape. Like you try like the Basis Peak or like a Misfit or like these little all the different concepts, and like maybe trying something for a while, kind of like Jay said, living with the incremental, living with these little moments. Some of it is what people want to tell you, and other things you learn from using them and you sort of think about and they stick, and then there's a parallel later on. So just by getting experiences trying those things, it's important. The conversations with the right people, certainly if they're people who are planning the roadmap, Qualcomm or someone like that, that's gonna, they're those are hugely important. conversations with creators, like Jay was saying, is very interesting. It's getting more interesting now because it's so much in the hands as that base keeps growing, more people using it, especially metaverse spaces. There's lots of unintended consequences, mass social groups, things still yet to come that I think are going to be much more a part of what covering the space is. But yeah, I think really just in a way floating around and hopping around and not saying no to trying things is important. Like I think about like and being lucky enough to kind of jump in and try to find where they are. Like Vario, call it one company, you know, like that, trying out demos of that was like a heads up on like the mixed reality landscape ahead of what, you know, other companies do. But that's just them. It's like a lot of things where you start to see, like, by the time you try one thing, you go, okay, I've seen this bit here and this bit there, and kind of shows where companies are borrowing from a similar conversation. So it kind of helps source that in some way, like to understand what's going on with all of that. So I think, to me, it does sound scattershot, but, you know, I think that there are a couple of, you know, really key platforms, but I feel like there are so many players that still haven't entered the space that it still feels embryonic. You know, I think mainly, you know, we're talking about, like, you know, Google, Apple, Samsung, like big part of the mobile landscape, and are not at all part of this yet. But some of them had before.
Yeah, all very good points, and I love the phrase kind of collector of experiences. I'd be curious to hear, is there any one aspect of this, or even a few, that you find yourself more interested in than others at this point? It seemed like maybe at one point haptics was really interesting to you. So I'd love to hear if there's anything specific that's you know, interesting in that sense.
Yes, this sounds abstract, but like, the haptics is interesting to me because I've been thinking about, like, I've been trying to think about the things I don't think about, I guess. Like, if there's a way, like, because I feel like VR has become, like Mark was saying, it's become more of a standardized platform, standardized types of apps. But I don't think it's not ready to be stabilized yet. And like, I think there's a lot more weird thoughts going in the landscape, and I think the sort of out of the box thinking of that still feels very much in the air. And so I get locked in too on the more I think about anyone covering any beat, like if you've been looking at phones for so many years, like where do you start thinking, where does your mind start getting a little locked in on, like, what you think a phone is, or, you know, what I think, you know, a metaverse is. So I think different senses, like different, you know, every time I use VR, I think about the senses that aren't there. And I've been reading about kind of like books about senses and just what it means to have a perceptual experience. And I feel like that's why haptics interest me, because it's like, I just feel like there are other things that need to click in terms of, and it sounds vague, but that's interesting. BCI, or like brain computer interface stuff, is very interesting. The neural input tech that Meta's been looking at for a while with Control Labs, but stuff where it's like, what else can it be? Because also visuals and audio have some limiting factors for a lot of things, accessibility and other elements. I feel like there needs to be a broader concept of what this is.
Definitely makes sense. Mark, how about you? What's interesting? What's not interesting?
We're kind of in the VR frame here, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess for me, I was really interested in the Control Labs stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, the BCI stuff is pretty interesting to me, just because I kind of buy into the idea that, you know, we should be thinking about this as a new and unique computing platform with, you know, and we need to, you know, kind of leave behind some of the old thinking on input methods. And, you know, and I know that that's how a lot of people in the industry are thinking about it and kind of pushing toward. And it does seem like that technology is a bit better aligned with the VR experience. maybe even more so AR, but that's a different topic, I suppose, or different but related. So yeah, I've been fairly interested in that, and hope to kind of keep watching that. I don't think people want to get an implant in their brain anytime soon, but I think they might wear a bracelet, that kind of, thought it was cool how it kind of like, the idea is that it kind of interrupts the neural messages coming down the brain to the hand, where you would normally type something. Or that's a pretty brilliant idea, I think. So would love to see stuff like that go forward. And I guess maybe on a more conceptual level, I'm wondering how giant neural networks might eventually play into the feeding of highly customized content in front of our eyes in VR might eventually end up. That could be a truly wild thing. I don't even, I'm kind of trying to imagine what that might be like and when we might get there.
Yeah, this sort of brings me to another, I think, thread, for us to pull on, which is one aspect that, is occasionally tricky about this space is that there are a lot of, if you talk about the metaverse, for example, a lot of people think of crypto or AI, or for some reason, all these other technologies kind of get entangled, within virtual reality. I think sometimes for good reasons, sometimes maybe not. But you brought up, those neural webs and some kind of emerging technologies. Are there any other sort of adjacent technologies that you find very interesting in terms of their interaction with virtual reality, like artificial intelligence or maybe blockchain, maybe not, but I'm just throwing a couple of examples out there. And Mark, we'll stay with you for just a minute.
Oh, thanks. Just when I have no further ideas. Yeah. I can't think of anything major right now. I'll chime in if I think of something. Sorry.
No, of course. Sorry to pick on you. But Jay or Scott, was there anything else that came to mind?
I mean, I think Mark has touched on it a few times, and I saw there was a question in the chat about augmented reality, in that, like, what could be interesting with the headsets we wear now are largely virtual reality headsets, but the rumor is that Apple is going to make it more mixed reality. And when does that turn over where we have really powerful augmented reality headsets versus just really powerful virtual reality headsets or gear? And I think augmented reality has a lot of obviously potentially cool ideas, like displaying your notifications in your glasses or showing you directions in a really obvious way. But as you saw with Google Glass, I think that's a decade ago now, maybe more, there's some real serious like privacy and security concerns with that stuff as well. And to address the question in the chat, I think many of these companies have gone full in on VR because that's almost a more controllable environment than sending everybody out into the world with augmented reality glasses with cameras that can record you at all the time. And we'll have to see how they overcome some of those really legitimate concerns to seeing those types of technologies out in the world.
It's a very good point, and something that I probably should have included in my original set of questions, which is that AR, VR, I don't know, question. And it feels like a lot of folks are waiting until they can figure out AR, Apple, for example, maybe to some extent, before really diving into this. And the advantages make sense because you go into VR and you're closed off and you look weird and, you can't check your phone, but AR is more seamless. So it would be interesting to hear or to talk a little bit about that distinction and maybe, Scott, how you view it. Are these things synonymous? Is it a spectrum? Should we be waiting for real AR until, this is going to get widely adopted? I'd love to hear your take on that.
I mean, I think that they're interconnected, but it's interesting. The more, particularly AR, the more I think about it as a concept and reading some books about it, theorizing and talking about the technology and the ideas, it gets into the more, and you can see some of these companies, including Meta, seeming to really kind of like reboot everything in their next phase of thinking on what these are. It kind of makes sense because I feel like the concept is different, and I'm not so sure it's a like, tune the, the outside world in. It could be, but it also feels like something that you want to essentially, I mean, the augmenting yourself. You should be able to not just get information, but going back to senses, like you should be able to have a deeper connection with things. It reminds me of kind of what wearable tech had been shooting for, for a while and way back, is this idea of what your watch is connecting with in the world. And then it kind of settled down into something a lot more notification-y and fitnessy. But that is something that I'm waiting to see interconnect more, because I'm looking to that's like a bridge thing. Also, one thing that the technology I'm interested in is seeing where all the wearable tech that we've seen kind of hits a second wave with where that stuff is going, because like all the watches or earbuds or whatever, they're going to form some sort of symbiotic relationship with those future devices in the real world. And similarly, AR, like Jay was saying, is so much, there's like a zoo of a world out there, and dumping AR into it means that the world socially, culturally, and infrastructurally needs to be ready for it. Some of that is like phones. It'll just be emergent and weird. But then I expect that like you need a next generation of protocols to have things smartly connect and be aware of stuff. Like everything needs to kind of, the stores and the cars and it's kind of like contactless payments. Like you kind of need like a new layer that, like Magic Leap talked about this for years, and other companies have talked about it with Qualcomm. But like, I have a hard time seeing how AR exists in a world that isn't built to receive it. And I would imagine that's part of the delay. So I think of AR like that. Otherwise, it's just a dinosaur standing in a street corner where people are going to be walking in front of it, and that's not going to be as fun.
Yeah, I mean, that does bring to light the complexity of the problem. It's the entire world. It's overlaying technology on the entire world in some respects, or at least every edge case that the world can throw at you. So it does get pretty tricky. Mark, was there anything within our the last 5 minutes or so that sparked anything that you wanted to mention?
Well, just really quickly, I'm just kind of repeating what was just said, really. I mean, you heard Jay talk about the privacy issue, which is still huge. That's, I think, my biggest worry about, I mean, first of all, just in case it hasn't been said yet, I mean, a lot of people in the industry, the holy grail is getting down to something like this, that is a set of augmented reality glasses that you wouldn't feel like a fool wearing out in public, and there's all sorts of technical problems that they're fighting against, trying to get there. They're, the waveguides and the light engines, trying to get those small enough. There's a big problem with getting a powerful enough processor in this, and yet having a way to dissipate the heat that processor makes. But these other problems may be even more serious. I mean, Jay talked about the privacy issue. It's like, I'm not sure I want to meet you on the street and suspect that you're capturing my image, and identifying my Facebook account, and sort of like, I don't know if I'm good with that. And then there's the whole, there's kind of the cultural thing that I think Scott was talking about. It's, we saw it with Google Glass, people just, outside of the privacy thing, I mean, they were called glass holes. I mean, they were just kind of like, in some places anyhow, people just reacted negatively against them, and I don't know, maybe these things will probably change, I guess, but again, like, how fast can these change, So I kind of feel like in some ways, I'm glad we're, maybe it makes sense. I for a long time I said, oh, well, yeah, if we're going to talk about the metaverse, let's talk about an open metaverse, that's open to the world, and we can, not be sort of closed in these VR things. But now I'm kind of thinking, with all these privacy and cultural concerns, maybe we're actually better off being kind of sitting at home in this closed environment where we can't hurt anybody else.
It's interesting. I had not considered that in terms of the trade-offs.
That's a pretty cynical look at it, but I'm that concerned about the privacy part of this.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be dealt with. And it doesn't seem like we're very close to doing that. Oh, my light's turned off. I need to move more. But I will make sure that I fix this. But before we do that, want to start to get into some of the audience questions. So the first one, very straightforward, want to just knock it out. We do have a publicist audience who is always curious about best practices, best tips for working with quote unquote tech publicists. What do you hate that they do? What do you like? We can go through this, maybe rapid fire if that works. Jay, do you mind if we start with you?
For me, I'm happy to receive your pitches to my email. Keep them short and sweet. As a news writer, my job is to write 3 or 4 posts per day typically. And so that means I'm working at a pretty fast pace. And so like, if I can't tell what your pitch is about within the header and maybe the first couple sentences, it may immediately get buried and I may never look at it again. And so just, I like to learn about what's going on. I like to know, what companies are working on and who's doing what, but pitches that are briefer are going to be the ones that I'm most likely to catch my attention.
Always good advice. Brief pitches, straightforward subject line. Scott, Mark, anything from you all?
Yeah, I agree with what Jay says. I like pitches where I'm hearing about technology that's sort of pushing against the sides of the box. I like hearing about new thinking, and I like hearing how it works described in very clear, simple terms. And I'm less interested in pitches that do that thing where they try to tie it to some news story that's happened, that the relationship between that and the technology we're talking about is strained at best. I would say, don't worry quite so much about fitting it into an existing story, but just if you've got something we're talking about it, just describe it to me.
Yeah, I can see the language.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like the hardest, the pitch that annoys me the most is the thing that, because it just gets confusing if you're trying to tie it to something else, and then it almost seems like it's that thing, and then it's not that thing, and you're like, oh my God, like I can't, like it's, so it's better to just also front load, whether it's a conversation or a demo or an embargo, or sometimes that gets buried a little, but not often.
Yeah.
This is going to be a terrible thing to say. I don't mind persistence. This is the worst thing to say. I don't mind persistence. You're like, woo! But I mean, like, if it's because I'm really bad at get flaky, and like there are things that drop away quickly. If it's something that really is related to what I do, and that's where you have to use your best judgment. It's like if it's a big company that I'm covering and it's something and it's a demo and I didn't respond, and it's like, yeah, I totally don't mind. Like I feel bad that I didn't get back, but it's like those are helpful because I've had some things that almost fell through the cracks, and then that persistence did pay off. But it really has to be that thing connected to something that is in the space. and feels big enough for that. So you know, I don't know what to say there, but you know, that's the most helpful stuff for me, because being able to scan that as things rush by and, you know, going around doing everything else, it's just good to have a record of whatever point that was being made. So then later on too, if I loop back and I start searching through stuff and I go, oh yeah, there's somebody who is a point person on it. That's helpful because it's like you know, the emails disappear after, you know, a period of time on the corporate end, but you know, it's but it's a good notepad in case I flake out on that, and it's good to just lay it out very clearly. So yeah.
Yeah, very helpful. So thank you all for going through that. Next question is from Elijah Alexander. And he is asking about, you know, essentially memory capture for AR, which speaks a little bit to what you're maybe referring to, Mark, or at least touches on it. But not without all the, well, there's certainly privacy concerns here. But he linked to a Twitter video, which I did see earlier, about, and I can provide this kind of in our chat just so you have it, you know, where there's this app that lets you relive past experiences, past memories, that sort of thing. So I guess he's looking for this idea of AR as sort of a memory device, and anything that you all think about that as sort of an application for it.
I mean, I think what the video shows, I haven't tried it myself, so I don't know like if the reality matches what's shown in the video. I mean, it's a interesting idea, but then I think of the broader cultural and societal questions that come with something like that. To me, it's related to the conversation of like, do you post photos of your baby on social media? And that's, you know, that's a different on a person by person basis. The baby, when they grow up, may disagree with your decision. And so, while I think, you know, I think the technology will certainly be able to do those sorts of memory capture things. I think there are way broader questions about how the technology is used that those are gonna take a long time to shake out. But I think those norms and what people are comfortable with finally lands on.
Yeah, that stuff is super interesting to me. I've written in the past about some elements of thoughts about memory, or sometimes looking at products, or just thinking about, like over the past decade, thinking about certain moments where I think about permanence of stuff or the fractured nature of it. The narrative clip way back, which was that little wearable camera, you know, thinking about it with Google Glass, and now we're already there with phones and cloud services, and the way, you know, they're literally called memories in a lot of ways. It makes sense that this is going to be part of it. I think what's interesting, like we get into like the AI element that's now the big wave and trend. And what Meta looks at for AR, which seems to be almost their demos have shown almost an appless environment of like very AI served predictive stuff. And I don't know if anyone's going to really want that or want that from Meta, but like the question of that kind of relationship to all the stuff that's you is a big unanswered question still. You know, people are wanting to lock down privacy and other things. At the same time, it seems like between OpenAI and these visions of AR and generative AI discussions, we're getting into this like appless landscape. I've heard that kind of thought process. I don't know where that leads, but it seems to have to do with everything that's you, and that could be your memories, and it could be like, what are the things it's serving up? So I think it's a big unresolved question.
It's very interesting, and also sort of makes sense as a means of interacting with an AR device. You know, it probably needs to be appless. It probably needs to be, you know, responsive to voice, or you know, interactions that are not primarily touchscreen oriented. So yeah, that's really interesting. Going in a different direction here. So I think we're going to do maybe one or two more questions, and I have one final question that I'd like to leave everybody with. So, very practical one from Danny Vasquez. Anybody attending South by Southwest and exploring, metaverse or VR related topics there? No from Jay.
Not going, sorry.
No from Scott.
I'm traveling a little. My traveling is a little more targeted now, so I've never been to Austin, sadly. So at some point, I've only virtually done a South by Southwest. So no.
Yeah, so that's no's across the board. Sorry, Danny, but you struck out in terms of this panel. I would love to hear about the single best experience the three of you have had in virtual reality, and maybe something that we can recommend to folks in the audience.
I can go first. I'm actually writing a story about this, so I guess a little preview for you all. I got invited to attend a comedy night within Horizon Worlds, this group called the Unknown Theater. Comedy in VR is a pretty known trend. It's very popular in VR chat. I'm sure there's an extensive history of comedy and stuff like Second Life. But I was curious specifically to see it in Horizon Worlds, which is like a platform that is very hard to get and keep users. So I was interested to see a community that was really excited about the platform. And I went to the show, and it remarkably felt like just going to a normal comedy show. The producers of the show booked talent to show up. They had a lineup. They had constructed a stage that looked like a theater. They had built this whole community around it. So it's like a weekly show that people go to. They were catching up ahead of the show, like, oh, how was your date on Monday? Who should I bet on for the Super Bowl? Like, it was the truest expression of these virtual worlds within VR and communities that I had ever seen. And I was struck by how natural and kind of like very human it felt. And so that was the most interesting thing I've seen in VR so far.
That's great and very surprising. I would not have thought of comedy as kind of the use case, for social VR. But there we go.
To me, it makes sense for. I mean, it's nice because it's like a condensed show. Most people can just sit and observe. Like, you don't have to do lots of things or worry about getting motion sick. And it lasts for an hour and a half, so your battery on your headset's not going to run out. Like, it's kind of functional stuff like that. I thought it was really cool.
That's great. Scott, how about you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Some of these are like live things I'm going to mention, and so you can't really see them. But one of the great apps that I really enjoyed was the Underpresents in Quest 2, which they did performances of The Tempest at one point that were live. It's like a weird kind of theatrical space. I don't know if they're using live actors anymore, but try to see a VR. Yeah, similar to Jay said, try to see a performance of something in VR, whether it's a Sundance or another experimental thing. The best thing I ever did was last year. This interactive acting teacher, I kind of wrote about it a little bit, brought a couple of us in to experimentally do improv in AltSpace VR. And so we were doing about an hour a week where we would meet and do these things to figure out avatar interactions and what, where things worked. And he was kind of working out these thoughts for a book that he's working on. And these are people I never met, and they started to feel like real friends and close contacts. And the work was really interesting and transformative, and it ended a little too soon. We were planning to do some sort of experimental performance, and it really brought this feeling of not only did the relationships feel real, but the place felt real. The memories of it feel real. And so I think that's where, when I think about metaverse and VR, I know there are moments we're playing mini golf, in VR. Walkabout Mini Golf has remained a favorite for me. Their courses are great, but there are moments where the stuff feels weirdly, it's hard to explain. It codes in the brain a little bit differently for me. And so that was the best thing. And Altspace VR's Burning Man performances were those experiences were fascinating. But that space shutting down is a shame. Really, it was also a sign of how many people are being unmoored. So that is it's concerning to me in terms of where these social spaces end up.
Yeah, in terms of that volatility, and the ability for that stuff to go away. That's really interesting, though. Mark, anything that stood out to you? Mark, I don't know if you are on mute. Yes.
Oh, sorry about that, guys.
No problem.
I'm not sure I have anything super great, but I have seen a few apps that are designed for PTSD people that I thought were good, and can't really remember the specifics, but I remember having a sort of visceral reaction to some of the relaxation and meditation tools that were in there, which I remember feeling like, wow, this actually works. This is changing my emotional state right now.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a believer in that. And then there was another thing called Rendiver, which their whole thing is they create content for old folks that are in rest homes, and it's just like they develop these pastiches of their memories and the music that was playing when they were young and things like that, which I kind of watched some people experience it and found it to be very touching. So yeah, that's a couple of things.
They're all great answers, and I think really speak to the promise of this technology, even if we're not quite there yet. But I know we're a couple minutes over, so thank you for being so generous with your time. Really appreciate everything that you were able to share today, Mark, Scott, and Jay. And I'm sure the audience did as well. So thank you all very much. Hope you have a great evening and afternoon on the West Coast. And we hope to talk again soon.
Cool. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was great to talk.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.